Hello, welcome back to my class. Professor Kent Lee here. So in the last video, I talked about the sociology article. It was a review article. And I didn't assign these. I did have you kind of find an article on your own, but I found some of my own that I thought were interesting. I just happened to have these, so I just randomly picked two articles. The first one is Applied Linguistics, Language Education. It is an empirical study. It's a quantitative study. And I'll put the information about it maybe down here on the screen. The effects of reading global literature on Korean EFL, English as a foreign language, learners' literacy ability and intercultural sensitivity. So there is an abstract. It doesn't have the header abstract, but it begins with an abstract, and it is kind of a bit of an overly detailed abstract. It's a bit too much detail. But, okay, I think there's a little too much detail about some of the details of the experimental study that was done. There's no background. It just jumps right into the study. The study examined the effects of da-da-da. So it's looking at reading global literature, that is having kids in a classroom read global literature in literature-based instruction, in terms of how it helps their general English reading ability. These are Korean kids in a Korean school. Their literacy ability, reading ability, and intercultural sensitivity, developing their intercultural, cross-cultural sensitivity to other cultures, and awareness of other cultures, for example. So the writer does a fairly detailed empirical study, statistical analysis, as it says here, so you can glean that from the abstract. And later in the abstract, it says the study results provided support for reading global literature as an effective and powerful instructional method to improve their literacy ability and cultural sensitivity. And they did this with two groups. So in the scientific method, you often have two groups, a control group and a treatment group. Here, the control group maybe read some very plain literature. In the treatment group, they read some kind of global literature, maybe literature in English from a different culture and such. Just like in a medical study, for example, you would have like a control group, they get a placebo, a sugar pill. In the treatment group, they get the drug that you're testing, the drug that you're interested in testing. And you compare the results and see if there's a significant difference statistically between the two groups by doing a lot of fancy statistics, which I don't have time to talk about here. That's how you do it. So there's an introduction, and it talks, so it starts talking about research studies, past research on language learning and culture in classroom context, especially EFL context, that is English as a foreign language, where English is taught as a foreign language. A lot of studies are cited here, even in the introduction. It's a bit heavy, I think, for an introduction, but okay. Including research studies about this kind of thing in Korean class contexts. And it says, studies show the influence of culture on language learning, but few have examined relationships between culture and second language literacy education. So I'm at the bottom of page 4 here. So the author is identifying a potential gap in the research. Yeah, they've looked at that, but what about this? This hasn't been examined well enough yet. So I'm going to, is what the writer is saying. So the writer then creates a couple of hypotheses. So the writer, in empirical research, especially quantitative research, scientific research, writers identify specific hypothesis. It is often at the end of the introduction or at the end of the literature review. The literature review actually is the justification or rationale or purpose for the hypotheses. In this case, it's at the end of the introduction. So here they are. Does using global literature with kids in might be a grade school or middle school classroom in Korea, an English classroom in Korea, does using global literature in such a context have a significant effects on students' L2 literacy ability? 2, does using this kind of literature, this kind of teaching materials, have a significant effect on their intercultural sensitivity? And 3 is more of a does it have any effects on their kind of a theoretical combination of these two outcomes, literacy and cultural sensitivity, which is a bit more technical, theoretical. Next section, review of the literature, or it could be literature review, whatever. Now, this is kind of a complicated topic, so the writer's broken the literature review into subsections. So there's general literacy ability, studies about general literacy ability and intercultural sensitivity, and definitions of general literacy, definitions of the terms, and then research on literacy ability and cultural sensitivity, including research studies done in Korea. So there's a lot of studies are cited here, including maybe one model that is kind of reproduced here, kind of a theoretical model to explain how this might work. And then the next part of the literature review is research literature on multicultural international literature, and in another section on global literature on Korean's English literacy development. Various studies are cited. Next section, instructional approaches for teaching global literature in an English class and such. So there are sources cited for teaching methods for doing this. Next section, methods. So in other journals, it might be called experiment or something like that. Here it's methods. It's basically the empirical study itself. So the writer has basically gone through the literature review to identify and discuss the gaps, and along the way, maybe the different research methods, and the writer is going to probably do this in order to justify the particular research method that he or she wants to do. So the methods section, the actual empirical experiment, the quantitative experiment. In this case, the writer is doing a classroom experiment where there are different classes that are taught either using maybe a more traditional way of teaching literature, and then this new way of teaching literature with global literature and some teaching methods that are different. So that is the empirical study that the writer is setting up. And this methods or experiment section can often consist of different subparts. One, research design. Research design is the overall design of the experiment, generally how it's done, maybe some justification for it, rationale for it. Two, participants. Who participated? Who are the subjects? When you're using people, like in a education study, who are the students or the research participants? In a psychology study, who are the participants who come to your lab to get experimented on? How do you get them? How did you get? Did you pay them or things like that? Three, instruments. That would include materials used, maybe some instructional materials, surveys that were given, interviews that were done, measurements that were done, like tests to measure things. Maybe there was a pre-test at the beginning to test something like their literacy ability, then a post-test at the end of the lessons to again test their literacy ability and to see if there were any changes, any improvements. So often you see pre-test and post-test designs. This starts getting into a lot of detail about statistics and such. So there are different questionnaires that were given. Those are the instruments or things that were used in the experiment. In other cases, it might be like the computer setup, the research software that you used in like a lab experiment, things like that. Next, the instructional methods and materials used for the treatment group, the experimental group, the data collection procedures, and how the data analysis were done. So a lot of statistics here. And the next section is called results, which is the statistical results. So there's a lot of statistics here. So this part you can maybe, when you're going through the method section or experiment section, if you're not used to this kind of stuff, you probably want to mainly focus on maybe the topic sentences, maybe look at the first and last sentences of the different paragraphs, skim over some of the technical details, skip over that, and just kind of find out generally what they're doing, how they did this. Results, again, if you're not used to this, the statistical results may be too technical for you. You can kind of skim through that. If you haven't had a statistics course, this may not make any sense to you. This one has a very detailed results section because the writer does a lot of statistical analysis. But you can probably look at the last paragraph of the results section where the writer summarizes the statistical results and basically what they found. The experimental group outperformed the control group on these measures, or there were differences in their scores in these measures and these tests and these outcomes. That's maybe what you want to look at. Look at the final paragraph of the results section. The next section here is called discussion or general discussion, or here it's called discussion and conclusion. Okay. The writer will probably remind you of the research hypotheses or research question, and maybe often say one by one, research hypothesis 1 was confirmed, or was disproven, or rejected, and then research hypothesis 2. In this case, the writer basically provides a very brief summary of what they did and why. Next paragraph, the finding, this is page 26, the finding of this result shows that reading global literature is a powerful instructional method to develop students' intercultural sensitivity as well as L2 literacy ability. In other words, the writer is saying this confirms research hypothesis 1 about literacy ability, and this confirms research hypothesis 2 about intercultural sensitivity. Then in a section like this, the writer will then provide some explanation for probably why this was and cite sources to help provide that explanation, and compare it with other studies that agree or disagree with the author's results, or studies that are different or support the author's results or differ from the author's results, and then maybe explain why. Well, Kim's study from 2010 got different results from mine, but it may be because they used a different kind of research design or different kind of tests or such reasons for possible differences. So the writer's going to cite other research sources that maybe kind of support her conclusions or her findings, and also sources that would help provide some explanation for why that is. So the writer does that in kind of one long paragraph. Often that's maybe broken up into multiple paragraphs in a general discussion section in an empirical paper. Next, the present findings have implications for L2 literacy instruction. So in other words, often in applied linguistics research, maybe you might see one or more paragraphs that say, based on this, there are certain implications for this. Well, it's not only helpful to teach this, but here's some suggestions for doing this and for implementing this. Specific recommendations for how this can be done in, say, an L2 classroom, a second language classroom, a literature classroom. So, for example, in this context, a grade school or middle school. So the writer goes into specific recommendations, again, maybe citing other sources to support her explanation of implications or applications. How would you do this? As well as the fact that this is probably necessary or a good idea. And there's also a paragraph on page 27. This study has demonstrated the significance of using such and such statistical methods. So the writer might say, hey, I use this method in this kind of research method or statistical method in a new way. This was really cool. Bragging. Okay, and more studies could be done like this. Then, page 27, there are future directions. So it's not unusual for a writer to point out possible limitations. Hey, maybe we did this with Korean kids at a grade school in Seoul. There might be problems, kind of generalizing our results or doing the same thing in, say, in a different kind of school setting and expecting the very same results. There might be some, issues, and maybe we need to study more of these other factors. Okay, what would happen if you do this in a slightly different educational setting? Would we expect the same thing? So there might be limitations, or say, hey, these are some other things we should study, and maybe we will study them in future research. Slightly different education settings, slightly different kinds of kids with different backgrounds and such. These are things to look at. And that's the conclusion. Basically, we found some cool stuff, and hey, let's study it some more. Reference section is in APA format, which is standard in such kind of research, language education research. Cool. Now, for a literature paper, I just picked something that I happen to have on hand. language education study was this journal, English Teaching, which is published in Korea by one of the really good applied linguistics and language education associations in Korea. It's a pretty good journal. Has really good and relevant research on English education within Korea. The next one is from Journal of English Language and Literature, published in Korea by an association of literature professors, English literature professors, and humanities scholars, throughout Korea, especially the universities. I just picked one article. I just picked the first one. Looked interesting. A representation of an African disaster in Gilles Courtemanche's A Study at the Pool in Kigali. So there is an abstract here. And so basically, this is a literature study that is literature analysis of a novel. So for those of you who like to study novels, English literature, this might be your thing. So this is actually kind of interesting, I think. I'm not a literature person, so this is a field I'm not familiar with, but it's kind of interesting to kind of look over. So basically, this is about a novel that takes place in Africa during the Rwandan genocide. So the Rwandan genocide is a famous genocide that happened in the African nation of Rwanda in 1994, in which about 800,000 people were killed. Mostly people from the Tutsi minority were killed by Hutu extremists in several weeks of extremist genocidal violence. So it's a very famous historical genocide. The writer is critiquing the novel. So it's a novel, and it's kind of an historical novel, historical fiction, that details the genocide and focuses on a fictional Western guy who's in Rwanda around this time, and I think has kind of a love relationship with a local person, local woman. So it's kind of about their relationship. The author of this research study, this literature scholar, is critiquing and criticizing this in this particular novel, and says that it kind of misrepresents African culture and kind of stereotypes or idealizes Africans and African culture. And this is from the abstract, it presents the genocide as an exotic African event and reproduces or promotes stereotypes about Africa and Africans and African culture, and kind of says it's kind of an imperialist discourse. Discourse is in way of talking and speaking, writing about something. Imperialist discourse, the way that, it seems to provide some interesting insights and makes people aware of this awful genocide, but at the same time, it does it in a way that's not very helpful because it's through this sort of Western filter, this Western lens, because the writer is, I think, French and the main character is French. Although it maybe is written in English. And from the beginning, the abstract of the writer is kind of saying, well, think about the media attention to events like the 9/11 attack in the World Trade Center and other, things that happen in Western culture, and the media attention they get compared to the media attention given to tragedies in Africa, and then later the way that Western narratives, whether it's newspaper articles or history books, discuss, events like this in African culture. Those events in African culture, in African history, get much less attention, and they're often kind of portrayed in this sort of imperialistic or idealized or westernized way that is not helpful, that actually, in fact, promotes stereotypes or kind of minimizes the voices of the African people. Minimizes is it filters them through the Western kind of interpretation and context, so you didn't really get to understand what it was really like for them. So it starts off with an introduction, talking a little bit about, in a theoretical way, talking about history and media attention to, again, these Western events versus media attention or the attention in other narratives, whether it's later, whether it's news reports or novels or history books, the way that events in African history are presented is really different. And then this leads into the novel that the author of this article is going to talk about. So the next section gives a little background on the genocide itself, and then how the writer decided, I'm going to write a novel about this genocide. The writing of the novel and its publication, and then goes into a little bit of detail about the novel, the summary of the novel. Now, it doesn't try to summarize the whole novel, but just the key aspects of the novel that are important to the writer's critique, the writer's analysis of the novel, the writer's critique and assessment of the novel. And in doing so, this writer is kind of like talking about certain aspects of the novel and events in the novel, and then kind of comments on them. So the key points are made by citing, maybe discussing, explaining one aspect of the novel, and then explaining it, analyzing it, critiquing it, criticizing it. So the writer kind of follows this kind of structure throughout the paper. Here's one event in the novel or an aspect of the novel, and explains it and why that's kind of problematic, why that's actually not healthy or helpful or good. So, for example, the main character of the novel, some guy named Bernard, first seems kind of indifferent to what's happening. So before the actual genocide, there are events leading up to it that indicate that something really bad is going to happen, and the writer seems unaware of what's going on, or he feels like he can't do anything. And yes, the writer does criticize some of the Western media. Okay, fine. But to the main character, it seems like the genocide is sort of portrayed in an impersonal kind of way. So the main character of the novel, Bernard, I mean, I haven't read this, but okay. It seems like he at first is kind of indifferent, and then he starts to say, hey, I should do something to prevent what's going to happen, but he feels like he's helpless, and he's in love with a local woman. He tries to stay for a while, but at the same time, he's actually kind of distant from the Rwandan people. So he's in the process, the way that the main character Bernard describes what's happening, describes Rwanda, is sort of idealizing and stereotyping Africans, according to this literature scholar, because the novelist is presenting Africans in Africa as something to be pitied, an object of pity for its poverty, AIDS epidemic, the social and political turmoil, the genocide, the death, and such. So it's sort of romanticizing Africa and idealizing in Africa, and so it's a beautiful country. After all this death and destruction and horrible things have been done, and the main character Bernard leaves the country before like the really worst stuff happens. He's able to get out, which is not a luxury that the Rwandans had. The Rwandans themselves couldn't escape. Western guy, yeah, he can leave. He can hop on a plane. He can go and escape the worst of it. Then he depicts the Rwandans, Africans, as just accepting their deaths in sort of a romantic way, sort of romanticizing the death. And then the main character, Bernard, he comes back to the country after the genocide has happened, tries to look for his lover, the woman. He can't find her. So in a sense, how the genocide is portrayed in this novel is kind of unrealistic. It's not really helpful. And on page 559, the writer of this article, the literature scholar, says that although the character Bernard provides some sort of eyewitness accounts and some truthful accounts of the horrors of the genocide, what's missing is the voices of the actual people of Rwanda themselves. Their perspectives are left out. It was like a horrible event. In the novel, we are only given the main character's third-person perspective from a distance, and not really anything from the perspective of the local people of Rwanda. So their voices are sort of diminished, reduced, filtered out. And for the writer of this research study, that of course is a problem. The main character Bernard in the novel returns to find some of his friends who are left and talk about some of the horrors. But some of his friends and his lover are gone, and we don't know what happened to them. Yeah, there's a little bit of white person survivor guilt, okay. But at the bottom of 561, more problematically, it says the novel's well-structured plot of a personal narrative, right, the main character and his, presents the Rwandan genocide as a past event. Okay, just as a past event, in a way that kind of minimizes the suffering and minimizes the voices of the Rwandan people. Then there's a conclusion section in this article that then comes back to this sort of theme of comparing how such events are portrayed in various Western depictions. When Westerners write about this event, it's really different from how Westerners write about things that happened here to us in the West. The 9/11 terror attacks, for example, it's really different. Whenever something happens in a third world country, in an African country, or someplace outside of the Western world, the events and the suffering of the people is filtered out. It's done in a stereotypical fashion. The way people are depicted and their suffering is kind of lessened. We don't hear as much of the first-person accounts and stories of the people and what has happened to them. It's filtered through, as this writer kind of calls it, an imperialistic perspective, or it's a perspective that's not very helpful. So he uses this novel as an example of how the voices of non-Western people and their suffering, their events, tend to get idealized or filtered out or minimized, and basically filtered through a sort of imperialistic Western kind of perspective or worldview. That's an interesting point. So there are sources cited throughout, for example, of how Africa is depicted, how African events are depicted compared to events in modern Western history, and such. There aren't as many sources cited as what you would expect in a more empirical kind of study. There are, of course, plenty of sources cited regarding the novel, the novelist, how it was received and how it became popular. Sources regarding what happened in Rwanda, sources regarding the depiction of this and other events and how they're interpreted by Western writers and how they're interpreted differently and such, as well as some theoretical sources about this sort of imperialistic perspective in writing. It's in MLA format, so it looks different. Within the text, you mainly see the author just mentioned maybe the page number or something like that. It's really different from the format, the APA format that we see in this, or the similar format in this sociology article. Within the text is quite simple, and at the works cited, you see basically like a couple of dozen sources that are cited, and it's in MLA format. MLA, Modern Language Association, is the citation format that's common in literature research and other related research fields and humanities. Sometimes in media studies, for example, in related fields, you see MLA. So notice that the literature research article is structured very differently compared to the other articles that I talked about. It's kind of more loosely structured, more free form. It really depends on, the writer's own topic, and how the writer is developing his or her points. It seems less structured. Sure, there's background information. The writer, as background, talks about the novel and how it came about, talks about the genocide itself. But it's not it's kind of woven into the other sections, because you have introduction, then you have a section talking about the novel itself, and that's kind of the main section where the writer talks about the novel. There is background that is explained in some other background about the genocide, but then the writer, in this main section, the writer is then basically first presenting, here's this aspect of the novel, and goes into explanation of why that is not very good. What are the problems with that? Here's this aspect of the novel, and it critiques and criticizes that aspect of the novel. Here's another aspect of the novel, critiques and criticizes that. Here's another aspect of the novel, critiques and criticizes that. Conclusion, writer brings it all together with kind of more general comparison of Western treatment of non-Western peoples and events. Again, focusing on how this novel shows this kind of imperialistic attitude, this imperialistic interpretation of non-Western peoples and events. So, interesting article, I think. Makes some interesting points about a novel that I will probably never read, but okay, it shows this is a good, I think, critique of, Western bias, or the bias of wealthy countries towards non-wealthy countries, even in our literature, in our fiction, and such. So if you're a literature person, take a look at that. It might be interesting for you. It shows how literature research is really different from some of the other kinds of research that we've talked about. And that's kind of the main takeaway. Research in literature fields is structured very differently. It's done very differently compared to, say, applied linguistics, social sciences, and such. And that will maybe help you to understand literature. It's structured differently. It often takes more of a theoretical or critical approach to the literature or other media forms that it's interpreting and analyzing and maybe even critiquing. It's a little different. So I hope that helps you, especially if you are more of a literature or media studies person. Okay, so that's it for now. Maybe in the next video, I'm going to talk more about the midterm, options for the midterm, and then talk more about proposals and literature reviews, which will be relevant to the midterm. So until then, I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.